Hey, great to be here. And I like our new format where we're going to get down to brass tacks about how to actually solve some of the innovation problems in healthcare, related especially to how innovations actually make it out into the field and get diffused into healthcare delivery organizations. I know that you and I participated in a quick little chat on LinkedIn on a post that Sachin put up. I was wondering if you want to just toss that up. I thought that was a great way of getting us started in today's episode. So, if we looked at this, the summary that he posted was that sometimes people are spending a lot of money. And the example that he gave is Super Bowl, potentially for him or others to go, senior executives to go and spend time with the vendors. And this is one of those problems that we've talked about both on HC Biz as well as Health Impact and other places, where my feeling is that a lot of vendors end up trying to get time with executives because the executives at a healthcare delivery organization or a health plan or wherever the buyers are, they're not telegraphing what they're looking to buy. And let me take a quick aside. For those of you that have done any work in government, like some of us have, you'll notice that in government, very little is not telegraphed. If you want to reduce or eliminate corruption, for example, in government, what you have to say is government has N amounts of dollars of budget for this kind of purchase. Let's say the VA wants to purchase digital health tools. We have $100 million. We are looking for subject areas A, B, or C, and these are all published. The budget dollars are published. What you're looking for is published. What isn't often published is the success metrics and the expectations. So we'll talk about that in a second. But this idea that a very large organization, I'm not talking about a small one doctor's office clinic, I'm saying you're a 500 million, you're a billion, 2 billion, $5 billion academic medical center, large hospital, a large health plan, for sure, you can telegraph on a website and say, here are things that we are looking to buy. And if you don't have something that we're trying to sell or that we need, it's okay, reach out to us and maybe there's something ad hoc that might come across, etc. But really the question is, why are gifts offered, tickets to senior executives? One can try to say that you're trying to bribe them. That's a cynical view,
Right.
saying that you're
And that's
trying.
the typical view that's taken. And I think that Sachin's writing from here is that he's concerned that it might be perceived that way.
It might be, yeah. And really,
Yeah.
I'm more of a positive thinker. So I say the vast majority of people are probably not out there trying to be corruptive influences or trying to buy favor or whatever. What they're trying to do is the following, and both of us have been in the startup world. What do we crave the most? We want time from our buyers to tell us what the heck they're willing to buy.
Yeah, right
So if
on.
I have to buy you a Super Bowl ticket to get you into a seat that I'm sitting next to, and it cost me $5,000 to sit next to you for half an hour to pick your brain and say, Don, what are you looking to buy? That could be a technique. So that's a $5,000, for example, ticket. And that's part of my customer acquisition cost. It goes to
Yep.
marketing, etc. But Don, what was your take on how Sachin pointed out this problem of maybe corruption, maybe not?
So I'll start by saying that from what I don't know Sachin, what I've seen of him online, I think that he comes off as a good person, and I think this comes from a good place. And I think that he's trying to do the right thing, and I applaud him for that. And I think on an individual level, making those types of choices, if that's in line with your character and what the way you think you should conduct yourself, then by all means you should. Where I start to have a problem with this, though, is when you're projecting or making an assessment of it as a problem. And I think, like on the surface, like you said, like you take that cynical view of it. Well, yeah, these gifts and bad things happen, and people get bribed into doing things that aren't in the best interest of whatever. The agency problems and all of that kind of stuff comes into play, and I get that. But I stop myself and I say, what problem are we actually trying to solve here? And this is just the way the business is done.
Yeah.
Right. And it's always been done this way, and it always will be done this way. And just because we're in healthcare and half of the money directly comes from the federal government, right? But indirectly, probably quite a bit more than that. That doesn't change anything, in my opinion. I agree. It's like we should all be behaving responsibly, but I want to focus on outcomes rather than focusing on methods to get there.
Yeah.
Within reason. Like you got to do things that are legal. You don't want to be shady. You don't want to be outright bribing people. You don't want to be taking gifts, like lavish gifts from places that don't portend to offer you any value at any point in time, right? Like I'm all on board with that. But generally speaking, like this is just how business is done, and I feel like we're chasing a ghost here, and that's kind of my initial reaction to it.
Yeah, and I think really the what's fascinating about this discussion, and that's why I really like that Sachin wrote about it. I've interviewed him a few times on stage as well. He's a thinker, right? He's one of those guys which are doing what we do, which is why are things the way that they are? And I think by him like throwing down this gauntlet was good because we're having this discussion. Because if
Yeah,
people
it creates a
don't post it,
conversation. I'm good with that too.
good conversation. Now, if we look at this in three different areas, one, if you're trying to have corruptive influence, this discussion is not for you, right? There are better ways of learning criminal activity. Please go somewhere
Exactly.
else. So that's one. We'll put that on the side. The other two, though, are if you want time with your customer, is this the best way to get it? And to me, there are really good ways to think about which customer are you trying to get a time with? Is it the senior executive? And Super Bowl tickets, etc., are often used for that. But we've also, like in my own world, when we're trying to sell something to nurses and doctors and physicians, clinicians in general, we buy them lunch. Why do we buy them lunch? Because if I bring in a pizza into a nurse's station, people are going to come by and I can talk to them. Right now, the question is,
They appreciate it.
and they appreciate it. Is that a corruptive influence? Should we be cynical and say, that's crazy, you're trying to bribe them with your thinking? And we're like, no, all I'm trying to do is get them to talk to me, and they're
So
busy
stop working
doing
for
other
1
things.
minute. Yeah, to eat pizza and listen to me talk. Exactly. Or be willing to like accept that I exist and hear me and maybe set a meeting with me. Right? It is an attention grab. And yeah, the difference between a pizza and a all expense trip to the Super Bowl is vast, of course, but you have to draw a line somewhere. And where is the line drawn? When is it inappropriate? When is it not? And like I'd break this down even further is that if you look at a senior executive of a health plan or a health system, they are probably, if it's a sizable system, have a multi-million-dollar salary. They've got options. There are all these things like they're taking money out of the system. I'm not saying it's wrong. Like they're ideally creating commensurate or value in excess, well in excess of what they're taking out. So I'm not saying like that's bad or anything. If you have that money, then you can afford to take yourself to the Super Bowl. Mm-hmm. Is that corrupted? Like, should we have caps on how much money you're allowed to make in healthcare because a lot of the money comes from the government? It's like, where do you draw the line? I think that's where, again, I think the argument comes from a good place and it's a good conversation to have and a good think piece. But it's just, why do you care if the money comes indirectly from a vendor that then charges too much later on to compensate themselves for that, and then indirectly Medicare sent you to the Super Bowl versus you took your salary out of Medicare money and then took yourself to the Super Bowl? Why does it matter where it comes from?
Yeah.
They're all fine if you're creating value.
That's right. And although one of the points that Sachin mentioned in his article was we tell doctors and nurses, and this is literally from his post, we tell doctors and nurses that anything more than a cup of coffee is a conflict of interest. And this is where that problem, like what I've done in the past and what pharma has done in the past, which is buy pens and nurses or fly them to Fiji, right? Do you buy them a pizza to get time from them or you do something else? Now, we could make the argument that if you're trying to get time with the customer, and this is where I say there's an actual solution to this working over time, and that is if you believe that people like vendors are entering your space and offering your employees and etc. money, why don't you just do what they want you to do, which is to give the information about what they're looking to buy? And so this is where I wanted to take this discussion a little bit. So if you scroll up to, I wrote a post right afterwards saying what we could do is in the hospital and health system community, what we can start to do is just like we have an About Us page on every customer's, on all of our websites, a list of our doctors and what facilities we have. Let's think about the idea, and we'd love to have other people join us on our future podcast to talk about whether this could work, is who is the first hospital, health system, academic medical center that says, all right, let's work on this problem. Let's create a area on our website, either in the footer or the header somewhere that says, what are we looking to buy in the next 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 quarters? Similar to how the government does it. You have a list where you say anybody over $500 million in revenue is probably writing a strategic plan. What your strategy is over the next couple of years. How about we translate our strategy into saying we are looking for digital tools in this area, surgical robotics in that area. We're looking to focus on cardiology versus health. Start to lay that out in your strategy by then indicating what purchases are you willing to make. So imagine that we had a web page or a series of pages, which we said, here's our strategy for the next 6 quarters, and these are things that we are willing to buy. Our budgets are, and you don't have to put down the budgets in the specific dollar amounts, but you can say our budgets are north of 2 million to 10 million. Give it a range. So if somebody's trying to sell you something for $8 million, they're going to know, I don't want to talk to this guy because he doesn't have a budget high enough. But if you're selling something for $80,000, you're like, oh, they have an 8 million, between a $2 to $10 million budget. Give it a big enough range so people don't try to get a lot of details. So if we said a website with strategic direction, strategic purchases as a transparent set of ideas, and then we can talk, and today we're going to talk a lot about the success metrics and how do you document those and how do you describe them as a follow-up to our conversation about the innovation lifecycle from our prior episode. You can start to put success metrics and say, I'm willing to spend up to $1 million a year on a digital dashboard for XYZ, and this is how I'm going to measure whether that dashboard has value to me. Okay, now think about this. What I just said could take us weeks or months to create in any typical hospital. Right? This is not a 5-minute exercise. But
Right.
what have we done? We have shifted from a supply side model, which said, oh, let's just listen to whatever vendor comes and buys our guy a coffee or a pizza or a Super Bowl ticket, and take from our strategy and move to what the vendor is. So if you're wondering at your institution why vendors are able to come in at multiple levels and move the strategy with your hardworking providers like nurses and doctors, etc., this is why. There is no strategic direction that is well articulated, given in a transparent manner, so that vendors know what to expect and what not to expect, because vendors aren't going to waste time where there's no budget. The old BANT, the budget and authority model that the salespeople use, if you're transparent with them, my argument, Don, is that lack of transparency is what is causing what Sachin is seeing, and that with weeks and months of general transparency processes starting to be put into place, we can start to reduce this. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, right on. So conceptually, I'm totally with you. I think generally speaking, more transparent, better than less transparent, more clarity, better than less clarity. And I think all of that's inherent in what you're talking about. And in order for a health system, whatever buyer, to be able to put this out into the world, they need to do all of the things that we're trying to advocate for doing, which is have a strategy, be able to prioritize your objectives within that strategy, be able to tie measures to them, be able to rally your team around them to agree and say, yes, this is what we want to do, and we all understand why. So all of those things I think are fantastic. And I think if you can find a way to get that into the hands of the vendors, then yeah, you're enabling vendors to come and serve you potentially and to align their products to you and everything else. Couple of potential issues here that I think are worth talking through. Number one, I could see, what are the common objectives we might hear? And number one, I think you might hear organizations reluctant to broadcast their strategy to their competitors.
Yeah.
So I know when we talk about that in the startup world, a colleague used to love what he'd tell a startup if they're like, oh, I don't want people to know what we're working on. We're in stealth mode. I was like, you know what I think you should do? I think you should call your most direct competitor and tell them everything you're trying to do, because that way you'll stop worrying about it and you can focus on actually getting your work done. So that's generally my approach to this, but at the same time, I could see someone say, I don't want the hospital across town to know exactly what we're doing next year, and I'd like to keep that secret. So what do you think the blend of those kind of throw the doors open strategy and keep everything secret so that I have an advantage over my competition strategy?
Yeah, it's a great point, although, and this is why I stipulated that if you're about a 500 million or above hospital, which is not necessarily a massive hospital, and it's not tiny either, you already have a strategic plan because your board of directors expects it. And if you're a nonprofit, by the way, that strategic plan is typically already published. What lacks there is a connection between your strategic plan and a procurement plan. And this is where you do want to say, and even the federal government gives you broad directions. If you read the federal government's budget every year, we're talking about trillions of dollars worth of spend, down to the lowest amount that they put down is typically $1 million. So Everything is at the $1 million and above level. And even if you think about a $500 million organization, if you even left it at that size and scale, you're not giving away the store, but you are at least giving away a direction. And that is if, and this is what I mean is, let's assume that you buy Sachin's argument that this is a wasteful expenditure. Buying the coffee is as wasteful as buying a Super Bowl ticket. Let's make that, if you believe that is a argument that your institution is
Right.
willing to make, then you have to say, in order to make sure that doesn't happen, here's what I'm going to do. If you said, I want to protect my money in my bank account, then you're going to pick a bank that at least has a lock, right? You're not going to say, I need to protect my
Fair.
money in this bank account, but I'm not going to check whether the bank has a lock or not. That's a silly analogy, but it's apt for this, which is if you want to reduce corruption, potential corruption, again, being cynical in this case, if you want to reduce corruption, the only way to do that from where we are today, there are more advanced solutions later, but from where we are today, a reasonable way to start is transparency. And the point that you made was very good, which is, and by the way, if you do this, you're supposed to be doing this anyway, right? You're
Yeah, you
supposed
have
to
to
be
do a
setting
lot of good stuff
your
to get there.
procurement policy
Exactly.
against your buying, against your
Yeah.
strategic plan.
Which ironically gives you a whole bunch of advantage over all of your competition. So it might balance things out if you let your secrets out. It all washes out. So yeah, basically what you're saying is don't address the symptom. The symptom being, I feel uncomfortable with this type of spending being done where it's government dollars on the back end. Solve the problem that spending is trying to solve in a different, more comfortable, more forthright way.
That's
as
right.
your suggestion.
Absolutely.
And I think as a basis for trying to come up with the next steps, I think that's a great way to think about it. But it brings me to the potential objection here. This is one that I buy more into than the strategy one. I used to do a lot of work with Canadian entrepreneurs, and all of them came to the U.S. to launch. And the reason why they were all coming to the U.S. to launch was because in Canada, they have a single payer entity, right? All of the stuff is government procurement. There's not really private procurement for things, which means everything's RFP based. And the way one entrepreneur put it is, we're innovating. We're doing something new. They don't write RFPs for things that have never been done before. So they're stifled in that model. Broadcasting, moving towards like, here's what we have money for and here's what we're willing to talk to you about, stifles innovation in that setting, because then I can't come talk to you because I don't fit into your model. And you've told me I can't buy you a Super Bowl ticket or, pizza for your nurses anymore to come in and go around that way. So that'd be my next layer of objection here. Kind of brings me back to that. Well, what problem are we really trying to solve? So this could be part of it, but I think you have to, what would be the angle, do you think, to your strategy to ensure that we don't box out innovation from the vendors that the health systems and the health plans haven't thought of yet?
Yeah. So in this particular case, again, if you just assume that if you're big enough, we're just using 500 million, but that could be 100 million, it could be $1 billion. If you go north of that, there is already a process in place in general for filtering out these kinds of problems. So what we don't have though is giving enough to vendors in order to know whether or not organization A or B or C is the right customer for them. Now, the point that you are making is, where does innovation occur? A large part of innovation occurs on the low end, not on the high end, for example. On the high end, if you walk into an academic medical center, which you have done a dozen times, what are they going to first and foremost ask? If you tell them, if I said, hey, Don, I've got this great idea, and here's the solution that we've come up with, the very first thing they ask for is social proof. And social proof is just a fancy way of saying, who the heck is using this?
Yeah, who can I call?
You rarely walk into an academic medical center with a solution that no one has ever used and say, hey, let's put this into your hospital, right? That's an insane statement. So where would you have gone anyway? You're going to go to the small and prove your point out. And in the small area, buying a guy a pizza, buying a guy a coffee, buying a guy a Super Bowl ticket is not a problem. It's because it's a little guy working on their own institution. And I think if we think about this in, like, how do we do this in sports? How do you build a NFL player or a NBA player or a Major League Baseball player. They don't just go straight to the major leagues. They
Yeah, high
start
school,
in the
farm league.
school, they move to college, then they move to a system where they're going to be put into an amateur scenario, and then they walk up the chain in many cases. So it's a
Yeah.
long process. That's how we build things as well. We would not, so an AMC is playing in the majors. You don't go straight to the majors. You start somewhere else. And that's why I don't believe that's a big problem.
Okay.
The Canadians and the folks in Middle East, Israel, wherever you're coming from, please keep coming, keep showing.
Yeah,
but
we're not
you're gonna
complaining.
drive there.
So that helps me connect that mental model. As long as we admit that the little guy who's funding the innovation is also spending government dollars,
Absolutely.
because that's going to be true too. And right, and that brings me back to the original, like why I feel the entry point to the discussion might just have been a bit off, is that we're all spending government dollars, and it's like really apparent in healthcare. But I mean, give me an industry, and I'll explain to you how they're all spending healthcare dollars, government dollars. So I just don't think that's the issue. I think the issue is we need to make sure that we're focusing on behaving in an ethical way, doing the right thing, generally speaking. Right? And I think most people do. I think, you can take the cynical view like, oh, everybody's out, everybody's corrupt, everyone's like this. I think for the most part, people are trying to do the right thing. They might take little advantages, but again, I'm fine with that as long as they're delivering at the end of the day. So like that's continue to focus on that problem. Then the last kind of objection I have, and this is probably more a product of where I do my work than anything else. So I might just have my perspective might be off again, but I've lived in this kind of small to medium world my entire life. Everything that I always joke, I sell things that don't exist for a living. That's what I do. And I'm always working in that innovative space. And whenever I would start to get into that kind of world of the structured RFP, I hated it. I hated it because I couldn't talk to the people. I couldn't find out what their real problems were. I don't trust that they did a good job of putting their RFP together, in the sense that they didn't do the things we've been talking about here. They haven't gotten the whole organization aligned around a strategy and come up with the appropriate way to attack the strategy and built success measures. They've said, we need a pop health system. We need analytics. We need, they've come up with some kind of generic thing and then put out an RFP. And I don't play that game well. So I hate that game. So that's my next objection to this. I don't want to create a world, or I don't want to promote a world where people do half-assed jobs of RFPs and then put them out there. That's harsh language. I know they work hard. They try hard, but they misdirected efforts on RFPs that go out there. And then basically the organization that knows how to play that game the best and put on the best show and the best tap dance to match up to the not super valuable RFP wins, as opposed to letting somebody come in and help them figure out what they need to do. So that would be my next kind of concern.
And it's a great concern, and it's a real one. This is where the government often does a poor job, because the RFP is trying to describe something from a procurement lens that really belongs in an operations area. So putting that aside, the problem that you just said is, how do we innovate even though you have an RFP? It's actually a lot easier than it may seem in non-government. In government, it's really hard because you have to follow the RFP. It is not true. You go to an academic medical center, a medium size, low end, wherever you are, the RFPs are a guidance document. They're not a legal document per se. Now, so I've done this many times where I see an RFP, and the very first thing I tell the customer is, hey, it looks like you guys have forgotten this success criteria, that expectation, etc. Can I come in and help you improve your RFP so that when you send it out to everyone, you get better proposals back? Right now, imagine that's what you walked in and said, your RFP is missing things, which means the solution, the vendors that come in to give you these things will be incomplete at best, right? They may not be horrible, but they'll be incomplete at best.
At worst, you say, completely misleading.
Absolutely. So we walk in and you say, look, I saw your RFP. I'd love to do you a favor. Maybe some point in the future, you can do me a favor by listening to me about my tool. But here's what I think you guys are missing. Oh, and by the way, make it public. Share it with your competitors. Share it with your vendors. Now, what have you done basically is you've made it harder for your competitors to respond to an RFP, because the information you are suggesting for the RFP of course will be self-centered. Of course will be self-serving because
Yeah.
you might do 10 things that your competitors don't do, and you should inject that so that the RFP is improved in such a way. This doesn't mean you're fooling the customer is not a fool. In that case, what you're saying is, let me give you value add, because that's what customers are always just seeking, right? They're looking for people
Right.
who are going to help them with things rather than, quote, sell them something. And this is the modern B2B, right? But we've heard of account-based marketing. What this
Hmm.
basically means is know your customer better than you know yourself, right? So if you get to the, you'll never be there, but that's the direction. And once you look at an RFP and you say, this is a innovation stifler, we've looked at it the wrong way. Look at the RFP as a intent that the buyer is looking to buy something, and then work the map. That's what we'll talk about what is really good input that you can give. The vast majority of RFPs that you will see will not have the simplest metrics, KPIs, metrics, test metrics, related discussions. And what that means is you can immediately add value just by doing that. So that's how I would
Yeah.
react to RFPs more than anything else, is look at it as an intent document and help them improve their document, which gives you value in their mind.
Yeah, I think that's a great strategy, and I think it would work sometimes. I think you can get their attention sometimes. You might have to buy them a ticket to a baseball game to get them to talk to you about working on their RFP, though.
Oh, by
But
the
I
way,
think that is,
if you see, if you're sophisticated enough to make an RFP, someone wrote that RFP, right?
yeah,
And this is where you say, do I go to the CEO or do I go to the guy who wrote the RFP? The person
yeah,
sending you the, like when you receive an RFP, it's either on a website or you received it privately. However you got it,
yeah,
it came from a known human being or a known email address. If you just reply to that and say, hey, I got your RFP, looks fantastic. It feels like you're missing a few items here. Could I send you some draft language that you can use to send to everyone else as well? Now, I'm not sending you something. I'd love
yeah,
for you to improve this so that your responses that come back, and this is really important, the point you made, which is if you got an RFP from someone and didn't respond to them and instead took the CEO out for dinner, you got a problem because that's the guy, they already wrote
you
the
might.
RFP.
You might. So yeah, I think that's an interesting strategy, and I've tried versions of that, but not quite with that language. It was more like, hey, let me come in and spend some time with you and help you, as opposed to let me without bothering you very much. I'll sit off to the side, or if you're willing to take a look at it, I'll write it and send it in there. Maybe I was asking for a little bit too much with my strategy of let's have a meeting, let's get your
Yeah.
team together, and I'll help you guys figure this out. So it's an interesting strategy.
Well, because
I
remember,
like it.
when you said so once you said, give me time and let me come in and work with you, that's a sale, right? That's a
Yeah, I
sales
just asked
pitch.
them to do two things.
Yeah.
I want them to
So
give me
you're not saying
things,
that, right? What do
not me
you,
give them things. It's
that,
a subtle change, but it's important.
very important to
Yeah,
say, I'm trying to give you something that can help you with the job you have been asked to do, which is receive proposals. The whole point of an RFP is to receive proposals. And as long as
yeah,
we write that language, and it might require a phone call, a meeting, take that guy to lunch, right? Procurement officers aren't supposed to be going to lunch with you anyway, but you could take that guy out to lunch if it's not a true procurement officer. It could just be the
yeah,
leader of a financial organization. It could be the CFO, etc. But this is really important, and I'd love for those of us in the audience that have had these conversations around RFPs. RFPs are an expectation document, and we're talking about expectations in an innovation lifecycle. So if you have got some ideas, send that to us. We'll get you on for a couple of minutes during our future episodes to talk about what is the reality of how you respond to RFPs. Are they innovation stifling, or could they be
hmm,
used in different ways? It absolutely makes sense.
yeah. Right on. I think the direct ask would be from both sides of the aisle, as always. Right, is if you are on the buy side and you have a really good process for generating the RFPs, come and tell us about it. And if you're on the sell side and you have found good ways to do anything like what we just described there to help an organization improve their RFPs or otherwise just get their attention early on, come and share about that. We'd love to talk with. All right. So in addition to those two asks, Shahed, let's try to put a bow on this. And as we're thinking about everything as we continue to do from the innovation lifecycle ontology, we're trying to codify this, help build a process, help the community build a process. What are the things we talked about today? Number one is the importance of doing the steps we've described so far on the buy side and the importance of putting together your strategy, broadcasting it. Maybe that's an RFP. Maybe that's another way we'll continue to explore. But to me, that's kind of like the first real important piece here. Would you agree or add anything to that?
Yeah, I would say even before heading to the RFP, putting a tidy bow on it would be find one organization who's willing to work with us to create a what I'm willing to buy page for the next 6 quarters. And it could just be literally a tiny page that explains our strategy and our strategic plan that we published last week is to do X, Y, and Z. We are looking to buy the following tool sets with these very broad budgets, etc. I just love to get one hospital in the next year, let's just say, to start putting that up. And I believe others will do it as well. So if you have an innovation center, you're already doing this, you're just not publishing necessarily everything. So maybe we can have that conversation and say, if you have an innovation center, you're doing the conversation, work with us, and we'll come up with a good approach for laying that out. And that gives you branding, exposure, etc. So that would be the first place I would start is don't go to a full RFP program. Just look for the basic publication and publishing program that could just be a website update.
Yeah, right on. That would be awesome. And then on the innovator/sell side, what do you think is the big takeaway here? Is it that bit that you gave about here's how you might respond to an RFP that you think is faulty, rather than trying to go and respond directly to a faulty RFP in a faulty way? Naturally, it would have to, but to how to maybe inject yourself into that process in a slightly different way. Is that the big takeaway on the sell side?
At that point, what you just said, inject yourself into the RFP process in a way that the customer feels that this guy is valuable for me receiving multiple RFPs that they can then evaluate. So I mean, that you can either be part of that process or you can be the receiver of that process. If you can ever be part of a process, you take it instead of being the receiver of it.
Yeah, right on. Okay, good. That's plenty for folks to think about, I think, coming out of this episode. So I say we wrap that here today. Shahid, always a pleasure. And to the listener, watcher, you can check us out at thehcbiz.com. We'll see you next time.